So let's get started. My name is John Strand. I am the token pen tester at this conference. We have a lot of, thank you, appreciate it. He's got the shirt and everything. Dude, we're going out for drinks later. Talk about being behind enemy lines. So this presentation is a little bit interesting. As I said, we're sharing this with the formerly known as Paul.com Security Weekly crew. So I think we had like 560 people register. I have no idea how many people we have in attendance now online. So it's quite a few people. And this is something that we do regularly at Security Weekly. We do monthly webcasts. So we talk about different topics. For example, we're going to try to get Lenny on one of these months to go in depth on remux and so on. But this presentation is dealing with how it's getting more and more apparent to me that the game of information security is starting to change. And it's starting to change in ways that are good, and they're also horrifying at the exact same time. Whenever you look at exploits, a lot of the stuff that that Lenny just got done talking about showed us all the ways that bad guys can put malware in a whole bunch of different file formats. We had PDF exploits, we had Word exploits, and what was the one thing that seemed to be in common with all of them? Every time he was talking about file format, he was like, hey, and there's a flash object in there. Hey, there's a shockwave object in there. And we see all this malware, we see all these different exploits and all these cool tools to dissect them. But what if that all went away? What if we're looking towards the future and exploits, as cool and as great as they are for reverse engineering, exploits and as cool as great as they are for like breaking into systems, went away? How would that actually impact information security as a whole? How would it change the way that we approach information security today? This is already starting to happen. A lot of the incidents that we work at Black Hills Information Security involve going into incidents where the bad guys didn't use malware, going into incidents where the bad guys aren't using exploits to get access to the network. And the thing about that is our testing is starting to reflect it too. This is one of the things I talked about last night whenever we were discussing defer and we were talking about the Stark exploits and all that stuff. We've changed fundamentally the way that we approach exploiting environments. We've changed fundamentally the way that we approach trying to replicate malware in our customers' environments. Going through the effort to create new pieces of malware that more adequately represent what it is the bad guys do is really on the front end of what we're doing, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But also working these incidents where the bad guys gain access to a network and they maintain access to the network using the exact same protocols that you use are some of the most horrifying incidents that we work. Because the bad guy can embed themselves inside your network and they can stay there for months, and in most situations, years, without even being detected. So how do bad guys gain access to networks in the first place? We're going to discuss that in just a couple of slides. But also, as I said, what if exploits disappear? What if you no longer had malware? We are going to talk about malware. We're going to focus on kind of a world without exploits. Would all the breaches stop? Would we be done? All of a sudden, bad guys wouldn't have anything to exploit anymore. Look at where all of our money is going in this industry. What company did Intel just buy recently? A very large security company. They bought, well, no, that was FireEye. Otherwise, now they're known as FireAnt. I owe Rob Lee for that one. They bought McAfee, right? They're planning on putting antivirus right into chipsets in CPUs to literally have a separate CPU looking for malware on your computer system. We've been joking about this for years. You look at all of the technologies trying to sandbox malware, or trying to sandbox executables so whenever they run, they won't be able to be exploited. But if they all were taken off the table, would we be secure? No, I strongly doubt it. In fact, I would go so far as to say it would be catastrophic for the security industry. And the reason why is a lot of times when we break into organizations and we don't use an exploit, they're like, how exactly, what product can we buy that'll help us detect that? What product can we buy that'll help us stop that attack? And unfortunately, there are no products for that. And the reason why is fairly apparent. It is easy for a vendor to write a product or create a product that detects malware. It is easy for a vendor to write a product like an intrusion detection system that'll detect signatures of an attack and an exploit going against your environment. These are easy problems. Have we solved those problems? No, they're the easier of the problems. Is there a product out there that'll help you detect somebody like Edward Snowden in your network? An administrator who goes rogue? No. And that's a hard problem. And the worst part about it, the incidents that you're going to be working over the next 5 years are going to be exactly like that. Not necessarily because of the trusted insider, but they're going to be that type of problem because the bad guys are going to get credentials and they're going to look and smell and feel just like a real insider. And this whole problem gets further compounded when you look at how we access our data today. What is the huge disruptive technology that we hear about all of the time? What is happening to IT infrastructures? What are we starting to do to them? You know, we're pushing them out to the cloud, right? So if all of a sudden your data is now accessible from anywhere, at any time, from any device, from your valid users, you no longer have a concept of a perimeter. Many organizations, when they move to cloud-based security technologies, they have no concept of centralized logging and management. Do you guys understand how now we're going backwards in computer security? Because that is ultimately where we're headed, and it's catastrophic because we don't have the tools, we don't have the techniques, we don't have the thought process to ever approach dealing with attacks where a guy has valid user credentials as well. All right, so I'm going to give you guys a couple of examples of how we've gained access over the past year on networks. And some of these will be familiar for the people with Security Weekly who have been through some of them, but sit with me. I've got a couple of other things like a Bit9 bypass. Anybody here use Bit9? I'm going to give you a couple of ways to bypass Bit9 tonight. Just a couple. There's a really great researcher out there, Kurt Schaefer, who has all kinds of beautiful presentations. And really, if I've ever found a way to bypass Bit9, it's because of Kurt's ideas, because he's always been an inspiration in that regard. All right, so this one is an informational warning in a vulnerability assessment scanner. So we ran Nessus against a target organization, and it came up and it said, informational. There's a page called hello.php. It was not red, it was not purple, it wasn't green, it wasn't even chartreuse, it was blue. So when we surfed to that page, hello.php, we found out that our customer had already been compromised. Does anybody want to take a wild, crazy guess how long this customer had been compromised? Hint, look for skull and crossbones. Since 2009, and this was like 3-4 months ago. We found this backdoor running, and it gave us complete access to the server. So we didn't even need to use an exploit. Why? Because somebody already exploited it for us, and we walked right in through the front door, and were able to dump credentials and then pivot around the network from that point on. Another one, informational, web server found on port 8888. Well, this one was one of those Tomcat Apache servers where you can upload your own WAR file. Has anybody exploited a system using this technique? It's amazing. At the beginning part of 2013, we had probably 3 pen tests in a row where we got access to a network simply by selecting a WAR file and then deploying the WAR file to their system. This was not an exploit. This is a misconfiguration, an easy-to-guess password. So we weren't really exploiting anything. There was no buffer overflow. There was no heap spraying overflow. We just simply logged in, uploaded a WAR file, and then navigated to that page, and we could run commands directly against the computer. And what level privileges were we running on? NT authority system. So we had full access to that system very quickly. All right, so now let's talk about Bit9 bypass. And this is the next couple of slides make me very uncomfortable, because we're talking about what's a world look like without exploits. How do we actually gain access to computer systems? And most of 2013, I spent telling my students, I spent telling my customers, you need to move to application whitelisting. You need to move to internet whitelisting. One of the things that's difficult about doing pen testing as part of the Security Weekly family is a lot of our customers listen to what we say, and we have to eat our own medicine. So a company will come to us and say, we listened to the podcast, we went to your SANS class, we implemented internet whitelisting, we implemented application whitelisting, we want you to come and pen test us. So now we have to deal with the crap that we created. It's like, oh, great, they actually do listen to us. This will be an awesome pen test. But we get an opportunity to play with some really cool secure technologies. So the first one is Bit9. How can we actually go about trying to bypass Bit9? And when you guys are done, if you guys want to write down your email address on a sheet of paper or something, or bring me a business card, I will get you guys the slides and the archived version of this webcast. Everyone will be able to get it and pull it down so you can see this. So if we go through, this actually comes from the methodology from Black Hills Information Security. It says launch interpreter listener to receive a connection. So this is literally a command you would run on a computer on the outside of the internet. You want to make sure it's directly accessible. It's not an RFC 1918 system. And then you create a shortened link to the raw invoke shellcode script at GitHub. So there's a number of different scripts out there that use PowerShell that you can download, and they will pull down and execute malware as well. And then from cmd.exe or any executable, or from a rubber ducky or any number of different things, you invoke PowerShell. You do invoke PowerShell, we're doing command, and we're opening up a web client to download a string. So we're basically pulling down our GitHub invoke shellcode. Then we invoke that shellcode, and then we feed in the parameters to that shellcode. We do payload, Windows interpreter reverse HTTPS. We put the L host for the connection, the L port, and then it executes. The reason why it executes is because PowerShell is not blocked by default in many Bit9 implementations. It just isn't. You run it, it works. It's beautiful. Also, some other forms we're going to talk about a little bit later, but this will basically create the executable, but it doesn't drop the executable to the file system. Does anybody know what you can do with PowerShell with executables to run them instead of dropping them to the file system? You can inject them directly into memory. Now, what happens to your AV, what happens to your Bit9 whenever the executable doesn't even touch the system as an executable? It bypasses it completely and it runs directly into memory. So that's very cool. And on the back end, we simply wait for the session to come back to us. And this is a standard interpreter session where we got full access to the computer system. Now, this isn't exploiting anything, by the way. We're simply using the built-in commands of a computer to execute malware, to trigger that malware. We're using PowerShell as the vehicle. Another major problem that we have seen with a lot of implementations is they allow jar files to run. Now, why would an organization allow jar files to run? Yeah, Java. How many of you guys need Java at work? I tell you what, every time like 70% of the class raises their hands, my heart sinks. We're never going to be rid of this Java scourge ever. So a lot of people say, well, we need to allow jar files to run. And we ran into a slight problem. This is a pen test from last week. All this stuff is kind of on my mind. And ran into a slight problem because it was getting close to the end of the day, and the CTO came in and said, hey, we want you to bypass Bit9. We're like, we did it. And he's like, find another way. We're like, yay. All right. So we got like half an hour to do it. And we tried to create a malicious jar file within Metasploit. The problem was they were running Bit9 and Symantec at the same point. And the basic jar file that Metasploit kicks out was getting caught by Symantec. So we had two options. Either option A, we would try to recompile the jar file and obfuscate it so it bypassed AV. That takes a while. It's doable, but it takes a little while. Or option B, we'd go find another backdoor that would most likely be acceptable. So this is my mistake, and I took a screenshot of it. We ran JR Desktop, and JR Desktop is like VNC, but it's Java-based. It's extremely lightweight. We're going to start incorporating this into a lot more pen tests. And as you can see, I fired it up, and I had it fired up while it was watching itself. And it started that infinitely recursive, loop, showing it again and again, and I took a screenshot of it. But yeah, just a simple jar file will execute if jar files are not disabled. So when you're dealing with technologies like Bit9, which I think is a great technology, it's not an issue of just turning it on and saying, we have Bit9 and we are secure. We don't have to worry about exploits. There's still problems. There's still things that are going to be lurking in the background that are going to bite you. Bit9 is a tool. It is a tool that requires you to configure it properly. You need to go through the exceptions rule sets. You need to see what you're allowing, what you're not allowing. You're going to have to choose where you're going to allow programs to execute from. There's all kinds of work that goes into it. And this organization wasn't lazy. They weren't lazy at all. I wish I could say, oh, they made huge mistakes. They didn't. They actually had things that they legitimately needed to run that were PowerShells. They had things that they legitimately needed to run that were jar files. So they just globally allowed those, and they thought to themselves, there's no way that anybody will ever use this to take over my computer systems, when in fact it did. It's always that point that you just don't expect to compromise you that ultimately comes back and it compromises you very quickly. All right, so whitelisting proxies. This is basically dealing with command and control. Another customer, Ethan was working on this customer about 6 months ago. And another customer at a bank that said, we've implemented a lot of things that you talked about. And one of those was internet whitelisting. And the reason why internet whitelisting works and it rocks so incredibly proper is you have a list of what known good websites are, and you allow people to go to those websites. And anything that's not on that list, you automatically block. Makes sense, right? So even if somebody does exploit you through a legitimate good site, as soon as the command and control triggers, it hits the internet and it gets dropped because it's not on the whitelist. So life is good, right? So this is usually the point where a customer locks us in a closet and then they walk away laughing, like, have fun with that. But Ethan's a champ. He sat down and he started looking at this and he started thinking about it more or less programmatically. This server that he's trying to connect to is one of our reverse command and control servers. And we have an HTTP payload that we use that uses clear text HTTP, and it does base64 encoding and an ASP view state parameter for all the command and control. Don't worry, I've got screenshots later. I'll explain what all that means. But if I can't even serve to the website, there is no way I'm going to be able to get command and control to work. So you start thinking about it logically. Whitelists. Many organizations will create whitelists of websites that are authorized. What do many organizations do for their own domain? They'll trust their entire domain. So let's think about this from a programmatic perspective. If you want to say everything from hackedcompany.org is authorized, how would you actually reference that in an engine looking at URLs? If I want to say hackedsite.org is allowed, can you write a specific signature for that domain? Probably not. Can you say it's going to be hackedcompany.org is going to be at the 4th byte offset? No, because you could have secure.hackedcompany.org, www.hackedcompany.org, server 14296.hackedcompany.org. And what that means is that hackedcompany.org is going to shift at various points in the URL. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So what happens if we try to access a site, but we use hackedcompany.org as a parameter somewhere in the URL? So what happens is people are using regular expressions whenever they're writing application or internet whitelists, and they're saying anywhere in the URL, if you say hackedcompany.org, you're in like Flint, you're a G. It's going to be okay. So Google was not allowed in this organization. So what we did was we did a Google search for hackedcompany.com kittens, and it blew right through. The reason why is because it says www.google.com search hackedcompany.com space kittens. And because hackedcompany.com was in that URL, at some point it says you're a G. You can come right in, you can go to the internet, you can do whatever you want. So from that point on, we served to our web server that we use for command and control, and what do you know? It's working. So what we then did is we set up so all of our C2, every time we communicated with the URL, we had a parameter called blah.hackedcompany.com, and it allowed us to bypass that internet whitelist. When we approached the vendor on this, the vendor said, wait a minute, this isn't a problem. This is the way it's supposed to work. You still haven't fixed it. Now, we've talked to a number of other vendors that we're good friends with. WebSense is working on it, and they're actually putting in better filters. So one of the things that a vendor can do is if they see two domains, the domain that's not whitelisted is the one that takes priority, and that's the one that's being blocked. So they're getting smarter about how they're actually putting in these filters. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So let's talk about how we communicate. Once again, we're not using any exploits. We're just using standard C2. We're basically uploading our malware directly into memory, not using an exploit in the process. This is another thing that is very frightening when we're talking about trying to detect traditional level attacks. So whenever you're doing, anybody here in the network forensics class? Cool. So you guys are in there with Phil Hagen, and you guys are looking at traffic that we use that's very similar to this. It's an earlier generation of this particular piece of malware that we use on a regular basis. And writing signatures for it, I hate saying it's impossible because that's just kind of a jerk thing to say, but it's very, very hard. So here's how our backdoor that we created at BHIS works. It uses clear text HTTP. So if you were sniffing this and you were looking at it, this is what it would look like, and the C2 is in here. But we created a value called view state. Now, by very nature, what is ASP view state supposed to be? What is it used for? Session information. By its nature, if you have session information, what is a quality of a good session identifier? It's random. So is that something that you can easily write a signature for? No, it's not, actually. So it's meant to be random. That's its goal. In computer security, that's the way it's supposed to be. And then this value is the C2. This is actually the beaconing for the C2. It basically is beaconing every 30 seconds this value, waiting for the C2 server to tell it to do something. So that's the view state parameter. It's a randomized base64 parameter inside of the URL. So if we go through and we grep through the pcap of this particular C2 channel being utilized, you see that we have a repeat here. It's basically this EY, 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 EY. What that is that's the beacon. Every 30 seconds, it's basically beaking out to the C2 server, and it's looking for commands. Here, this one, it doesn't really, it says EY, which is also saying we're receiving a command, but back here, it's receiving a command from the server. So it's receiving a command from the server itself. Now, if we take that, and we copy that, and we paste it, and we do base64 decode in Python, you can see the command itself. And this is actually the invoke shellcode PyInjector attack that we were talking about just a couple of slides ago. So how do we actually go about detecting something like that? I mean, you can't write a string, you can't write a signature for it that says, okay, this particular value is always going to be this fixated length, and it's always going to start this way. You just can't. You just can't. So here you got commands. You've got the ID of the command that's going to be executed and queued up. This is the command that's executed on the operating system. And then interval 30 tells it how many seconds to wait before it looks for another command. So it basically just beacons out again and again and again. So we've already covered a couple of different things. We can gain access and exploit systems without even exploiting systems by taking advantage of misconfigurations. If we take over a computer system, once again, we don't have to use an exploit to get malware and get C2. And sometimes the malware doesn't even touch the hard drive. Last night I talked about Rob Lee changing the way I approached breaking into systems. One of the things that Rob Lee said to me that was fascinating about 6 months ago, it was about 3 months ago, is he said more and more in the world of forensics, we're getting away from doing hard drive analysis. It's moving more and more to memory analysis. And I think that was fascinating to me because that's the nature that we've been moving. And having that communication with Rob really helps us move the way that we do our tests to more adequately match what it is the bad guys are doing. So we've covered a bunch of things, but how can I actually gain access to a network? How can I learn about the network to attack your network? Well, we've been working a lot on trying to manage and merge physical and virtual on the same plane. So we can get an idea. This is a tool that we've written called Pushpin. It was originally written by Ethan Robish, and then Tim Tomes took it over. And what this tool does, you can give it a latitude and longitude, and it'll pull every single tweet, Flickr picture, YouTube video. YouTube's broke. Google has a way of breaking things. Picasa and so on from that specific latitude and longitude. This one's kind of cute. This is Apple headquarters in Cupertino. One of the Apple employees is actually leaking product keys for Microsoft Windows 8 through his Flickr account. He's taking pictures and sharing that with the world. So that's neat. And we also look for things like mixing business and personal. This came from a pen test that we did a little while ago. We had a couple of people, it was actually a couple of parents, and their kid, they were trying to send their kid, I think, to Washington, D.C. They were doing a fundraiser. So we saw that they were using their work email address, and we were able to spearfish them saying, yes, we would absolutely love to fund sending your kid to Washington, D.C. Come check out our company website and download the malicious Java applet that takes over your computer. So, you know, the more I learn about you as an individual, the more likely it is I can get to understand what websites you go to, the more likely it is that I can understand what it is that you're interested in, and the more likely it is that you're going to click links, and I'll do things like harvest user IDs and passwords. One of the main tools that we've been using recently is we'll send you a link or we'll get you on the phone and we'll get you to a website, and this is kind of mean, but a standard social engineering call goes like this. I call you up and I say, hey, this is John Strand from Computer Security, how you doing? And usually, whenever you say you're from Computer Security, what do most people think immediately? Oh crap, I did something wrong. I will do anything this man asks me. And then I'll say, well, have you heard about the recent breach? And I'll make up kind of a competitor. So let's say it's healthcare, health insurance. I'll say, did you hear about Blue Cross Blue Shield in Texas? I'm like, no, what happened? Oh, they got breached. It's all over the news. It's going to blow up even bigger than some of the news stories we've seen recently. But what happened is the bad guys got access to the Blue Cross Blue Shield web servers by weak passwords. So what we're doing is we're having all of our users here at work go and come up with secure passwords. And we got this new website. We need you to beta test it. I'm selecting people at random to check out this website. Can you please go check it out? We'll go to the website. And it says enter your user ID and your password. And it says password strength meter. And as you enter your password, the little meter goes from the left to the right, so showing you how strong your password actually is. It starts red and it goes green. And people will get there, and sometimes people will be like, wait, this seems weird. I'm like, oh, it's fine. It just checks the strength of your password. If you notice, there's no submit button. So we're not capturing your password anywhere. Meanwhile, we have Ajax running in the background that's just harvesting their password constantly, but that's another story. And say, oh, could you please enter your user ID and password and just give me a feel for if it worked for you? Can you get to the website and tell me what it says? Oh my gosh, I just put my password in and it says it's weak. I'm like, wow, that's a pretty big. You don't have to change it now. Please don't change it now because I'm logging into your account as we speak. And then I'll tell them, some tips about some strong passwords, and I'll basically be like, and the other thing is, be on the lookout. They're making phone calls. If anybody calls you and asks for your password over the phone, don't give it to them. In fact, call me immediately. What's your number? And I'll give them my real number. So that's pretty horrible. But it's very easy to get people's user ID and password once you know more about them. Like in this example, I would call this individual and let's say Chris. I'd say, hey, Chris, how you doing? It's John from the security team. And he'll be like, oh, John? I'll be like, yeah, we met I don't know, it was a couple months ago. Hey, how's your daughter's fundraising going? I've got your name. I say I'm in security. You're doing stuff with fundraising. What happens to your trust level with me as I say more and more about you? So, and I don't need exploits for that. Now, how bad can it be? See, sometimes I call people to get their user IDs and passwords. Many times I don't need to. And if you're part of Security Weekly, we've talked about this quite a bit. If you're in my class in 504, we discussed that. But we have a whole bunch of people here at DFRCon in wonderful Monterey, California, that don't know about this. So a lot of your users, they will use the same password that they use for work at third-party sites like IO9, Krakatoa, Fleshbot. What's another major breach? Let's see, we got Snapchat, we have Adobe. Adobe is just the gift that keeps on giving, isn't it? I actually got a big poster of me hugging an Adobe sign with an Adobe sales representative getting mad that I'm hugging his sign at Black Hat. But at any rate, if somebody uses their password at work and then they use the same password on a third-party site, we can reach in and we can query the internet and we can find those passwords. And we can pull down those email addresses. And a lot of those people are using the same email addresses that they use at work. So here's an example. Whenever we run ReconNG against a pwn list, we have two email addresses here, and then we have their passwords. Now, whenever we provide a report to a customer, we redact the password, but we have the clear text password. And many times what we'll do is we'll log in to your VPN endpoints. We'll log in via our desktop to your environment. Once again, no exploit required. If you have an external VPN, you have our desktop exposed, we walk in through those exact same portals that you use. So how many accounts do we get when we do this? I can do a live demonstration a little bit later, but let's just say it's bad, like really bad. Rand Corporation 48, NSA.gov was 135. We ran this yesterday in 504. How many did we get with NSA? I thought it was in the 200s. 222 accounts compromised at the NSA. Northrop Grumman Corporation, 697. Disney Corporation, 222. And you can run another command and you can pull every single one of the password hashes or clear text passwords from these third-party breaches. Point is, security is no longer yours alone. You know, it's almost been a lie for a long time that we go to organizations, we're like, if you do everything right, if you patch your system, you've got IDS, you've got IPS, you've got internet whitelisting, you've got application whitelisting, if you do everything right, you're going to have a secure network. That's no longer true. It never was, really. Because all it takes is one user using their email address from work, setting up their password from work, and registering for an account at Adobe. And then you have a direct backdoor into your environment. There's some technologies that help. RSA, or two-factor authentication, is a good thing. And this makes my heart happy. How many of you guys use two-factor authentication at work? We're seeing more and more all the time. Right up to the point that we get another RSA breach and it blows that all to hell. But hopefully that doesn't happen anytime real soon. But the thing that's hard about that is those RSA tokens, we've noticed in a lot of organizations, are used heavily on the desktop. But if we can find an external RDP server that has that disabled, it doesn't matter. So that's very, very difficult to deal with, and it's very difficult to reconcile as well. All right, so how would I find RDP? This is a great, great, great website. This is exfiltrated.com. I don't know if you guys remember, but back in 2012, there was a story about somebody who took over a good portion of the entire internet. It was something like 150+ million computer systems this individual took over. So if you took over that many computer systems, what would you do? Huh? Do that. He scanned the entire internet, port scanned it, whole thing. And he made all of his results and all of the information publicly available. And then he removed his malware. He said, I'm just a security researcher. I don't have any evil intentions. I just took over, most of the world, and I used it to port scan the internet. And here's my results. It's like, you could have just asked Fyodor for those results, because I'm sure he has them. So these results are publicly accessible. So if I'm trying to break into your organization, I won't scan your network directly using Nmap. I'll go to this site, and we have a database. H.D. Moore released the results. He did the same thing. He didn't take over half the internet. He owns the whole thing. But he released his results at DerbyCon, and you can download those. But this is an older version. You give it a starting IP address and end IP address, and I can search for a specific port, and it'll bring back every single system that's listening on that port. The beautiful thing is I don't even have to attack your network. No exploit required. I can find that port, connect to that RDP server, and then try the user ID and password that I found with your organization on a third-party site. So it gets getting kind of crazy, right? I find a breach notification for Stratfor. I pull down a user ID and a password for somebody in your organization. Then I use the internet census that a guy port scanned the entire internet to find RDP servers, and then I log into your system. How would you detect that? I mean, seriously, if somebody logs into the same service, the same portal that you use, using the same password that you use, they're almost indistinguishable at that point from a legitimate user. There's other services out there. This one is broken today. It should be back up shortly. It's called VPN Hunter. You can give it a domain, and it'll automatically go through and try to find the SSL VPNs, remote access, email portals, and then generic login sites. Yeah, you use two-factor authentication to log into the workstations, but if you have external-facing web applications, a lot of organizations don't require two-factor authentication for that. So the issues that we're really dealing with here is we didn't solve the internal threat. Eric Cole wrote a book that was beautiful years and years ago about detecting insider threats. And he has a lot of great recommendations that nobody really implemented. It seems like if people are confronted with two options, an option where it's easy and it doesn't work, like let's say blacklisting AV. Blacklisting AV, you can install McAfee. It's easy to do, but it ain't going to give you very much in the way of protection. Or I give you something that's hard, like Bit9. Yeah, we can bypass Bit9, but at the same time, it's a whole lot more effective than AV, and it's difficult to implement. If you give people those two options, many times they're going to be like, I'll just do easy and ineffective. Is that okay? Because that's what we choose time and time and time again. And it's unfortunate because I think in many ways, those are the options we've always had. Those are the tools that have been in front of us, and we somehow believe that those are the only tools we have available. Sometimes you got to think ahead. There's really cool solutions out there. Internet whitelisting, yeah, we can bypass it, but it's getting better. Application whitelisting, yeah, we can bypass it, but it's getting better. And even in their current states, they're infinitely better than our blacklisting technologies. So we've got to be kind of looking for that trade-off and trying to make the right decisions moving forward to make our networks more difficult to break into. But the insider threat issue is something that we haven't even begun to think about. Many organizations, I say, what are you going to do for the insider threat? They're like, we trust our people. No, you don't. You really don't. So now we have to deal with external attackers with legitimate, valid credentials coming in. And our current technologists that are not really prepared to detect these things. In fact, some of them really go out of their way to not alert because of false positives. like, oh, we don't want to alert, after somebody doesn't fail or fails to log in externally, we'd be getting alerts all the time, and that's true. So how can we start detecting some of these attacks? And this is just the beginning of a conversation, kind of like the active defense stuff that we did years ago. But this is the beginning of the conversation. I hope that people come up with more ideas. The first thing is shares. All right? If you look at what's the first move an attacker makes whenever they break into your environment, they'll get access to your system, and let's assume that they're not using Meterpreter. Let's assume that they're not using malware. It's just going to be them, a workstation, and a command prompt. And for many of us in pen testing, that's all we ask for, right? Just give me a command prompt on a system. That's all I need from that point on. And one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to try to access shares. I'm going to try to see what shares are available on the network. And then, once you find shares, what are you going to do if you're a pen tester? What's your next step? Download everything. You're going to try to download and access as much as you possibly can. So when you get back to work, go up to a workstation, run netuse. And then I want you to run, netview. Tell me what you see. Is there anything sensitive? Are there any servers that you see named out that you really wouldn't want an attacker to find in their first move? Something like backups, help desk, support, password cracking system. I don't know. These are systems you generally wouldn't want an attacker to see right away. The big shares that we look for are shares that are associated with admins and help desk. We'll look for servers with names like admin01. Unfortunately, most organizations that we test today, they'll have admin shares or help desk shares, and they'll go in and grant everyone access to those shares in the domain. Now, whenever I enable everyone access to a share in a domain, what does that mean? Everyone? Be more specific. If you guys, yeah, no username required. It's like the movie The Professional. Everyone! They don't have to authenticate to your domain. Anyone that can talk to it can pull down anything off of that system. And that's a lazy share. We see it all the time. If you want to at least lock it down to authenticated users, there's a group called authenticated users that requires them to at least authenticate. And another crazy idea is restrict these shares to admin and people associated with help desk as well. We're far better at dealing with shares in really 2002 and 2003. The reason why we were better back then is a lot of tools like enum, null session tools were just hitting the streets, and everyone freaked out. They wanted to go through and protect their systems from these nasty tools and these null shares and anonymous logins. So we really got good at locking them down, but we forgot. In the last 10 years, we're getting far worse at locking down our shares. So somehow we lost our way. We need to do better. All right, so detecting the insider. If you cannot detect an insider, your network is not secure. End of story. When we're auditing and working with organizations and they say, we want to know if we're secure, give me a valid credential, don't tell your security team about it, give me a day and see if they can detect what I do. If they can't detect me, you have serious problems in your security architecture. The Chinese are kings of this. Gain access with an exploit to one system. Once you gain access to that one system, find a way to pivot and gain access through legitimate services and persist. And that's what we did. I was talking about Rob Lee's exercise with StarkNet. First time we exploited, he's like, go! So we went in, exploited a system, got valid credentials, and then remote desktop in. And he's like, no, dude, you can't do that. I said, why? He goes, I can't write a lab around that. There's no way anyone's going to detect that. And we sat around long and hard trying to figure out how we could make a lab out of that. And that was really, really difficult as well. Also, can you detect a user downloading and accessing thousands of files at a time? So here's another question. How many of you have failed file and object access auditing enabled in your environment? 1, 2, 3, someone on this side, please. 4. 4 people. And one of them is an instructor at SANS. He doesn't count. He's not a real person. Don't look at him. You'll just encourage him. He'll think he's real people. We need to start doing this because whenever you look at a lot of attacks, they'll find that file server and they'll try to download everything. And some of those things they may not have permissions to access. So if you have failed filed object access enabled, you'll see them fail at trying to access different files. And they'll light up like a Christmas tree. If you really want to get spunky enable failed and successes on your file print server. The reason why that's really spunky, and it's funny when I talk to people about it, they're like, we can't do that. Why not? That's a lot of logs. Really? Is that a problem? A lot of logs. Are you guys capturing a lot of logs now? How many of those are useful? People are like, okay, so I got a spin lock log. What the hell is a cephomore? I got about 20,000 of those, but I'm not going to log when people are accessing files and successfully and failed. Once again, you got a choice: easy and worthless, or hard and provides value. That's really where we're at. And imagine if in an incident, your boss comes in and says, what did this account have access to? And you pull up a roadmap. These are all the files that they accessed. These are all the files that they tried to access. That's value in an incident. It's much better to say that than saying, well, we got a bunch of things on spin locks and cephomores, and I don't know what the hell that is. But we're collecting it because, ArcSight ingests it. So, hey, let's go with that. If not, you really, really need to. Some other things you can do. Logs that you're most likely not reviewing. Sure, I'm sure a lot of you guys are watching for locked accounts, right? How many of you guys are watching for locked accounts? If a high number of accounts become locked out, awesome. But are you monitoring the total aggregate number of failed login attempts? Another thing that we do as an opening gambit, post-exploitation, getting access to a system, is we will take one password, and this is something we talked about in 504, and we're going to talk about it in 2 days. We will take one password, and we'll use that password against your entire environment, every single user ID. Will that lock out any accounts? No. No. So how many of you guys have really strong password requirements? Upper, lowercase, alphanumeric, special characters, 15 characters long, no dictionary word. Do we have anybody with insane password requirements? On behalf of the Chinese and the pen testing community, we would like to say thank you. You've actually made our job easier. This is something really, really important to understand. Because you make something a pain in the ass for your user population, it does not mean that it makes it more secure. Okay? So many people look at things and are like, wow, this really sucks. That must be secure. No, it's not. So the reason why it's not, if we're talking about passwords and what people use, I'll give you an example here. In most organizations, if they have really, really insane, crazy password complexity requirements, upper, lowercase, alphanumeric, special character, and no dictionary word, and long, there's no human being that's going to come up with a password that's easy for them to remember. So what are most users going to do? They're going to do patterns. That password in most organizations, oh, thank you. Capital P password 1 bang. Right here. That string right there, if you work in an environment that has really long secure passwords, that one is going to be a sizable percentage of your population. What's awesome is as soon as we break into accounts using that, they're like, all right, we got you. Okay, cool. We're going to blacklist that password. Okay, we'll try this one. So we can just come up with all kinds of crazy passwords. People will do that. And it's funny whenever you work in organizations like that and you see people enter their passwords, they're sitting there chicken pecking them, and you're like, oh, you're doing little square patterns. I got it. That's easy. So don't ever start to think that just because you're making something very difficult and painful for a user that you're making your network more secure. That's not true. All right, we talked about file and directory auditing for sensitive directories and files. I don't expect you to turn on for everything, but if you have a certain directory where executives are uploading files, or if you have a certain directory where you have really, really sensitive research data, you better turn on full success and failed object access auditing for that. Are you watching for concurrent logins? How many of you guys are watching for concurrent logins? Oh, come on, at least one? Thank you. Concurrent logins. Bad guy gets access to a network. And they get access with the level of credentials and the level of access that the account they compromised has. So if they get access to my network and they get access as John, they will have permissions as John. They will then take that account and they will pivot and they will try to log in to as many resources as possible to pull down files to gain access to as many things as possible. Does that make sense? That's a trick. Once again, if you're doing incident response, one of the things you'll see is all of a sudden the Strand.js account is logged on to 150,000 systems Is that bad? It must be Nessus. No, it's something that should be investigated, and there's tools that allow you to actually limit the number of concurrent logins. Now, you're going to have administrators and help desk personnel that absolutely need to log on to multiple systems. That's part of their job. You should set up like a jump gate system where they have to log in with a different credential and jump gate from that in order to do it. But you should not have your user population, or at least unmonitored, access 23 computer systems without you knowing it. So this is kind of like the beginning of like detecting an insider, and a lot of this is based on what we've done. When we gain access to a network, we pivot, we access a lot of computer systems. When we get access to a network, we pivot and we do password spraying across the entire environment. This is the way we do things. A lot of what we do is based on what we've learned from the forensics curriculum at SANS, what we've learned talking to people about breaches and incidents. One more thing. The single easiest thing that you can do to shut down attackers in your environment is ridiculously simple. Turn on your host-based firewalls on Windows. NetSH firewall set, op mode, enable. You can put in rules that allow your systems administrators to access the workstation. Say that this subnet over here of these guys, they can access your systems. But your computers, your workstations, should never be able to talk to each other directly. Treat your internal network as hostile, because it is. This is not hard. This is not difficult. But what's hilarious about it, organizations, a lot of vendors don't sell this to you because you already have it. You can turn it on in Microsoft Windows and you can push out the rules very easily. And then what does that do for you? Well, if a bad guy takes over this system here with the 80s I'm sick sticker, or don't drink, it's poison, or as we also learned at my house, daddy medicine, if this system is compromised and they try to do ps-exas pass the token, our desktop pass the hash to these other computers and the firewall is up, they're locked. They can't get into any other resources nearby. One of the things we always do is we pivot to other resources, and if you've got me locked down, it really severely limits and constrains what I can do, and it has the added benefit of having additional alerting for you detecting those internal pivots in your environment. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. If you guys want a copy, don't send me an email. Please, please, if you're if you are seeing this at Security Weekly through the GoToWebinar, don't worry, I've got your email address. I'll send it to you. Please don't send me an email. I'm probably going to look, and there's going to be like 500 people logged in, and they're all like, let's all send John an email. Instead, send an email to Paul at Security Weekly telling him how much you love him, and tell him that you missed him at the webcast. That would be awesome. For those of you that are in the room with me, bring me up business cards or a little sheet of paper with your email address. Please block print it. My kids enter them. That's kind of what they do for allowance. And a lot of people use like this horrible chicken scrawl, and it makes my daughter and my son cry. So, you know, take your email address and write it down, and I'll get you guys the slides and also the archive. As I said, I work at Black Hills Information Security. I would be absolutely honored if your organization would keep us in mind if you ever need any testing or if you need a hug. Right. So any questions? We have a couple of minutes before we transfer over to the next presentation.